I woke that morning believing I was about to marry the man I had loved for 7 quiet years. The apartment smelled of jasmine tea and butter croissants, the way my mother always made breakfast on important days, and I lay still beneath the linen canopy for 1 extra minute, listening to my sister hum in the kitchen. I did not want to rush the feeling. I wanted to carry it into the reception, into the chapel, into every photograph that would later be tucked into my mother's silver frame. And I wanted to remember the morning exactly as it was, because I suspected, somewhere beneath the hull of my own happiness, that a morning like this one would only happen once. Our mothers had already cried over the seating chart the day before, blaming the flowers for their tears, and my sister had pinned a tiny blue ribbon into my hair because she said it brought luck. I had smiled into the mirror like someone whose life was finally, gently, beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I believed the future was the place I had been promised. The dress had been steamed twice because my maid of honor could not stop touching the hem. It was ivory, with a quiet lace bodice my grandmother had sewn by hand the winter I turned 22, and a skirt that moved like water when I walked. The veil had been boxed for a week. My shoes had been broken in at home on the carpet so I would not limp down the aisle. I had packed a small white bag with tissues, 2 safety pins, a tiny bottle of perfume, and the vows I had rewritten 4 times because I wanted them to feel true and not at all borrowed. The morning moved the way mornings move when a person is being gently carried. Slowly, brightly, full of strangers who smile at you in elevators and waitresses who whisper good luck, sweetie, as though they too have been waiting years for this particular happiness to land on a particular bride. I ate half a croissant. I drank the tea. I let my mother fasten the pearl earrings I had worn to my father's funeral, the ones she had only ever taken out of the velvet box for occasions she considered worthy of him. My sister touched my shoulder and said, "You look like her, you know. Not just today. You look like the woman she always wanted you to become." I let myself cry a little, because I thought they were happy tears, and because I thought the day ahead deserved a small, honest rain. I had not cried at my father's funeral. I had not cried when I packed his watch into the velvet box after the burial. I had been the steady daughter, the one who signed the papers, and answered the condolence cards and remembered where the spare keys were kept, and I had been proud, in a quiet, exhausting way, of being able to hold everyone else together. My father had been a man who believed that steadiness was the highest form of love, and I had modeled my whole life on his, without realizing that a woman cannot model her whole life on a man's without also inheriting the small quiet injuries his steadiness had cost him. Today I let myself be the held one. I let my mother brush the loose hairs from my temples. I let my sister take 3 more photographs she would later admit I had asked her to retake twice because the angle was not flattering, and I did not, for once, care if I looked exactly the way she wanted me to look, because the morning was already doing the only work a morning can do on a bride, which is to teach her that she is allowed to take up the space she has been given. I was, for the length of one bright morning, a woman who had been loved correctly, and who believed she was about to be loved that way for the rest of her life. We drove to the chapel in a white car with white ribbons on the door handles. My mother held my hand in the back seat. My sister took photographs of me through the window, laughing at her own reflection. The sky was the particular blue that brides always remember as a sign. I believed in every sign that morning. I believed in the weather and the music on the radio and the soft way my mother said my name. I believed, with my whole chest, that I was being led into the rest of my life by a man who had waited for me as patiently as I had waited for him. I had told myself, more than once in the months leading up to the wedding, that the long spell of being almost married was simply the cost of building a proper life with a proper man, and I had not minded paying it because I had thought the cost would end with the dance. I had thought the vows would be the receipt. I had told my mother, when she asked whether I was sure, that sureness was not the question. The question was whether I was willing to keep choosing him every ordinary morning in the small repeated ways that mattered more than any vow. I had answered my own question yes. Then, just before the reception, he chose my best friend. The chapel ceremony had been small and warm. We had said the vows I had rewritten 4 times. We had exchanged the rings I had ordered from the jeweler on Archer Street. We had kissed at the altar to a polite, hopeful applause. And then, in the half hour between photographs and the cutting of the cake, while the pianist played something soft under the jasmine arch, and the guests laughed over champagne, my fiancé walked into the bride's suite with my best friend on his arm and told me, without hesitating, that the ceremony had been a mistake. He said it the way a man confesses a small clerical error, a thing quickly amended. He said it the way a man tells his secretary that the wrong document had been sent, that the right one would be along shortly, that she should not worry about the inconvenience. He did not sit down. He did not take my hand. He stood in the center of the room I had been getting dressed in for 3 hours, in front of the mirror I had been smiling into, and he told me, in the language of a man who has already moved on, that the woman on his arm was the woman he should have chosen. He did not even look guilty. He looked lighter, almost peaceful. The way a man looks when he has set down something heavy he had agreed to carry for the wrong reasons. He stood beneath the jasmine arch in a pressed suit, his bow tie loosened just enough to suggest he had been thinking about this for a while, my best friend on his arm, and said, in a voice softer than any he had ever used for me, "I do not love you anymore. I think I love her now." It was the softest sentence he had ever said to me. It was also the cruelest, because I realized, standing in my grandmother's lace, that he had been keeping his softest voice for her all along, while he had handed me the flat, careful, contractual voice I had mistaken for honesty. The room became very quiet, in the particular way that rooms become quiet when something important has just been decided. The way train stations become quiet when an announcement is being made. The way chapels become quiet when the minister clears his throat before the line that will change a life. My mother, who had been straightening the train of my dress that morning, looked up from the chair where she had been resting and saw my face before she understood the words. My sister lowered the camera in slow motion. The way a woman lowers a weapon she realizes she will not need to fire. The photographer took a single frame of the 3 of us, the only one of the day in which all 4 of us, including the absence of my father, were arranged in the same composition, and which none of us ever asked to see. My father's chair, at the back of the room, was empty and exact, and the small folded program we had laid on it for the ceremony was still there, untouched, the only honest thing in the room. The pianist missed a chord and did not recover it, and the silence that followed the missed chord was the loudest silence I had ever stood inside. The lights in the chandelier seemed to flicker once, though it was probably only my own breath catching. My best friend's hand rested gently, possessively, on the inside of his elbow, as though she had always known where it belonged, and was merely announcing what had been true for longer than I could bear to imagine. My best friend stood beside him wearing the exact smile she had always worn when she wanted something that belonged to me. It was the smile from the year we were both shortlisted for the scholarship and the judges picked her. It was the smile from the summer we both tried out for the role, and they cast her. It was the smile from every late night she had borrowed the dress she knew I had been saving for a date. I had mistaken that smile for enthusiasm for over a decade. I had believed, because I wanted to believe, that my best friend was simply happy for me. I had been loyal to the idea of her longer than I had been loyal to him, and the betrayal on his face was nothing compared to the betrayal of realizing how long she had been practicing that exact expression. I had once told her, on a long walk the year we both turned 17, that I would never forgive a friend who took a man from me. And she had squeezed my hand and said she would never do such a thing. And I had believed her with the whole weight of a teenage heart, which is to say I had believed her without evidence at all. My engagement ring slid off my finger as though it had been waiting years for permission to leave. It was my mother's ring, set with the small diamond my grandfather had placed there on his wedding day, and it fell into the palm of my hand with a sound I will never be able to describe, a sound like a small thing forgiving a long argument. I closed my fist around it, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I did not want anyone else to see it fall. The ring had been alone, had only ever been alone, even though he had proposed with it. Even though he had promised, on one knee, in the lamplight of his mother's kitchen, that it would stay on my hand until he replaced it with the proper band he had been saving for. He had not replaced it. He had not intended to replace it. He had intended, I understood now, only to wear me down gently until I had forgotten that the promise had been made. He chose me, she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, and I understood then that her cruelty was not a lapse. It was a verdict. She was telling the room what she had decided, in the smallest, proudest voice she could find, and she was daring anyone to disagree. I had watched her, for many years, perform the kind of woman she thought other women wanted her to be. I had watched her compliment my mother in a voice that carried 3% too much warmth. I had watched her purchase a card for my graduation that said exactly what a card should say, no more. I had watched her sit next to me at my father's funeral in a black dress I had not seen before and not at all afterward. I had watched her do all the small things a kind friend does. And I had been proud of her in the dim, unquestioning way one is proud of the friend one has been assigned by the long coincidence of childhood. I had not realized that she had been watching me too, with a kind of attention I had mistaken for care, and that she had been waiting, with the patience of a person who is sure they will win, for the day the object she wanted would at last be within reach. I refused to cry in front of them. Not because I was brave, because I had learned, over 7 years of loving a man who could not quite look at me, that crying in his presence had always made him uncomfortable. I had learned to fold my sadness into small, private sounds. I had learned to leave rooms slowly and close doors without slamming them. I had learned to perform steadiness even when I was shaking. I had learned to be the woman who did not cause trouble. And that morning, in the bride's suite, with my mother 3 feet away and my sister holding a camera she would never use, I refused to give either of them the satisfaction of my tears. I had already given them 7 years. I had given them every birthday I had organized, every hard conversation I had softened, every small humiliation I had absorbed because I had believed that love was a thing one offered without requiring it to be returned in equal measure. I would not, on this single morning, give them my face crumpling in public. I would not let my mascara run down the lace my grandmother had sewn. I held my breath. I lifted my chin. I gathered the train of my dress in one hand, the way my grandmother had taught me to handle any garment that had been stitched with intention, and I walked alone through the garden doors that led to the gravel path behind the chapel, the path I had walked 1,000 times as a child with my father before he became too tired to walk with anyone at all. The door made a small sound when I closed it behind me. The sound was barely a sound. It was the sound of a woman deciding, in one breath, that she was done performing for an audience that had never really been watching her. I did not slam the door. I did not pause to listen to the noise inside. I walked, with the careful dignity my grandmother had insisted upon, along the gravel, past the small stone bench where guests were supposed to throw birdseed instead of rice, past the trellis where the white roses had not yet opened for the season, until I reached the wrought iron gate that separated the chapel grounds from the street where the cars idled. Outside, a convoy of black vehicles waited near the gate without explanation. They had been idling for nearly an hour. The drivers had stepped out to smoke, leaning against the polished doors, watching the chapel with the bored alertness of men paid to notice things other people pretended not to see. The city feared the man at the center of that convoy, the Mafia boss who never smiled in public and never apologized to anyone. And I had heard stories about him, of course. Everyone in the city had heard stories. He was said to be the kind of man who could end a conversation by standing up. He was said to be the kind of man whose silence had ended friendships, businesses, and an old city councillor who had once tried to cross him in a dispute over a contract. He was said to be 40-something, with a face that never appeared in photographs because the photographers who tried to photograph him did not enjoy the careers they had afterwards. He was said to be capable of patience in a way that frightened people more than his anger, because his anger was at least legible, while his patience was the patience of a man who keeps a small, very precise ledger and settles accounts when the time is right. He was said to be unmarried, and the women who had tried, over the years, to attach themselves to him had a way of disappearing into one quiet private life or another, and the city had long since stopped asking questions about any of them, except occasionally, in the careful voices of people who still remembered how to wonder. He had witnessed every word through the open window of the bride's suite. The jasmine arch had been framed by a lower casement that had not been properly closed, and the glass had carried my fiancé's quiet confession into the courtyard like an echo in a museum. The boss did not move. He simply stood near the lead car, hands at his sides, watching with the patience of a man who had been watching other people's mistakes for a long time, and had stopped expecting them to make new ones. His guards were 4, 2 at the rear and 2 at the front, all of them in dark suits, all of them watching me walk toward the gate, as though I were the weather. He stepped toward me slowly, his guards parting like water. And when he was close enough that I could see the small scar along his jaw, the silver in his temples, the slow, measured way he breathed, he asked, "Are you all right?" I should have said yes. I should have said nothing at all. I should have walked past him to the parking lot where my own car was waiting, gotten in, started the engine, and driven home without once looking back at the chapel where my mother was probably, at that very moment, choosing which of the guests to ask for help with the cake. But I did not. Instead, furious, humiliated, and absolutely unwilling to let my fiancé or my former best friend see me shatter, I reached up, because I was wearing heels I had broken in at home, and I had not yet had time to take them off. And because the morning had made me reckless in the particular way mornings make women reckless when they have just been handed a thing they did not choose, and I grabbed the lapel of his black jacket and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was not a careful kiss. It was the kind of kiss a woman gives when she wants the man watching through the window to understand that she is already somewhere else. I had wanted my fiancé to see me, even just for a moment, in the arms of the most dangerous man in the city. I had wanted him to feel the precise, surgical sting of understanding that I was no longer waiting. I had wanted, even if only for the length of a single breath, to be a woman he could not predict. The kiss lasted 3 or 4 seconds, and tasted faintly of black coffee and something bitter at the back, the way expensive cologne lingers on a man who has not yet eaten breakfast. His mouth was warm and absolutely still, as though he had been kissed before and knew exactly what to do with a person who had been angry long enough to forget how to be cautious. His guards froze. Nobody had ever dared to kiss their boss unexpectedly. Not a bride in a ruined dress, not a stranger in a garden, not a woman who had just been abandoned in front of her own family. I pulled away at once. I stepped back. I tried to remember how to be a polite person. I could feel, at the small of my back, the stiffness of my grandmother's lace where I had pressed it against the iron gate. I could feel the morning air, the cool of it against my collarbones. I could feel, with the sudden, terrible clarity that only arrives after a reckless act, exactly what I had just done. "I am sorry," I whispered, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. He did not look angry. He did not look pleased either. He looked at me for a long moment, the way a man looks at a thing he is trying very hard not to misread, and asked, very quietly, "Was that for revenge?" "Maybe," I admitted, because there was no point in lying to a man like him. He tilted his head, almost imperceptibly, and the corner of his mouth moved by a fraction that did not quite become a smile. "Then do not do it again. Not unless you actually want me." That single sentence, delivered with terrifying calm, rewrote the meaning of the entire moment. He had not rejected me. He had, in the gentlest possible way, told me that I was worth more than a gesture. I had spent 7 years offering gestures to a man who had learned to mistake them for affection, and I had not realized, until a stranger said it in a garden, that I was also offering them to myself. He offered to drive me home. I refused at first, because I still had pride left and very little else, and because I did not yet know if accepting a ride from him would be the kind of decision I would regret in the morning. He did not press me, and that surprised me more than the kiss itself. A man rumored to break wills with a single glance, who never smiled in public and never apologized to anyone, simply waited by the open door, his hand resting lightly on the frame. He did not explain himself. He did not remind me of who he was. He did not allow his reputation to do the work his patience would have done anyway. He waited. The morning, as if it had spent its cruelty, began to settle into a calmer light, the kind of light that arrives after a thunderstorm has cleared a city. "You are trembling," he said quietly. "I know. Get in the car. I will not ask twice." I got in the car. The seat was cool leather and smelled faintly of cedar. The door closed with a soft, expensive sound. He did not touch me. He did not look at me with pity. He did not begin, in the patronizing way men sometimes begin, to tell me how sorry he was that this had happened to me, as though my humiliation were a sort of weather that had moved into my life uninvited and would eventually pass. He simply started the engine and began to drive. When we drove through the lamplit streets of the city, the windows half open, and the night air carrying the faint smell of restaurants that were just beginning their dinner service, he told me, without cruelty and without flattery, that my fiancé had never deserved my loyalty. He said it as a fact, the way a man might say that a particular bridge could not hold a particular load, and I understood that he was not insulting me. He was describing what he had seen. He had watched my fiancé say the word love the way he said the word work, as a task he had been willing to perform only so long as it had been convenient. He had watched my fiancé keep his arm at the right distance from mine in photographs. He had watched my fiancé laugh at the right moments and check his phone at the wrong ones. He had watched the way a man watches a thing he has decided is not worth his full attention, and he had been right. And I had been wrong. And the admission of this came to me, sitting in the back of his car, in a way that did not feel like an accusation but like a small, quiet opening of a window. I had been too loyal to crack myself. I asked him, half suspicious and half grateful, why a mafia boss cared about a stranger's broken engagement. He did not turn his head. He watched the road. He said, after a small pause that felt longer than it was, that he had known my family for years through quiet business channels my father had used before he became too tired to use anything, and that he had quietly admired my character long before that afternoon. He said my father had once done him a favor he had never been able to repay. He said my mother had once sent a small envelope of photographs to a hospital where his sister had been admitted in the spring of a year she had not wanted to remember. He did not explain exactly when he had first noticed me, only that he had noticed, and that the man I had chosen to love had not been the man he would have chosen for me. There was no flirtation in what he said. There was no hint that he was positioning himself as the alternative. He had simply, quietly, noticed me for a long time, the way a man notices a certain kind of weather, even when he has no intention of going outside. I did not notice you tonight because you were abandoned, he said, eyes still on the road. I noticed you long before that. I noticed you the first time I saw you laugh with your father at the bakery on Madison Street. He said it the way a man might say something he had been keeping for a quiet hour, a thing he had been carrying quietly for years, a thing he had not planned to say but had decided, in the moment, was true. He said it the way he said anything, as a thing to be considered, not as a thing to be argued with. I did not know what to say. I sat quietly for 2 blocks while the city passed in soft yellow light, and I tried not to cry in a way that would have relieved the air inside me, but would also have embarrassed me in front of a man I barely knew. He did not pressure me to speak. He drove me home. He walked me to the door of my mother's apartment, and when I thanked him, he only nodded and told me, "Sleep. Tomorrow is a different kind of day." I went inside. I took off my grandmother's lace. I unpinned the blue ribbon my sister had tucked under my hairline and laid it on the dresser, where it would sit for the next several months without anybody moving it, until one day, in a small ceremony that involved only my mother and my sister and a glass of warm tea, I would pin it into the hair of my niece. I washed my face in the small bathroom my mother had retiled the year my father died, the soft sea green tile with the uneven grout lines she had insisted on laying herself because she had wanted my father's hands, even in absentia, to be the last ones to touch the rooms he had built for us. I stood for a long time with the cool water running over my wrists, which had been stinging since the rehearsal dinner for no reason I had been able to name, and a small, very clear thought occurred to me, the kind of thought that arrives only after the loudest part of a storm has passed. That I had been forgiven for the 7 years. I had been forgiven by no one in particular. I had been forgiven by my own body, which had finally stopped asking my skin to hum in the way a woman's skin hums when she is being slowly, politely, expertly starved. I did not cry. I had been the woman who did not cry. That evening, in the small bathroom with the lavender-scented soap my mother kept by the sink, I let myself be the woman who simply stood very still and let the water do its quiet work. I began spending time with him in the days that followed, not because he asked, but because he left space for me to arrive. He never asked me to become someone softer, louder, or more grateful. He never tried to fix me, never paraded me in front of the men he worked with, never demanded that I perform the role of forgiven bride a second time for the benefit of anyone who had failed to love me the first, protected me without controlling me. He listened without interrupting. When I cried in his study at midnight over an old song on the radio, a song my father had once hummed while he made pancakes on winter Sundays, he handed me a glass of water and sat with me until I was ready to speak again, and when I finally did speak, he did not tell me I was being dramatic. He did not tell me I was overreacting. He simply nodded, as though he understood that grief had its own timetable and could not be hurried along by any man's good intentions. His house was not what I expected. It was quiet. It smelled faintly of books and old wood. There was no obvious gold, no obvious marble, no obvious display of any kind. There were bookshelves in every room. There were small sculptures on the window ledges, the kind of objects a man collects when he has been alive long enough to learn what he likes. There was a photograph on his desk of a woman and a child I did not ask about, and he did not explain. There was a window that looked out over the rooftops of the city, and on clear nights, we would stand there without speaking. And the city would look back at us the way cities do, with all its small lights and small promises, none of which were aimed at us specifically, but all of which seemed, for the length of an evening, to agree that we had been allowed to belong. He never tried to be younger than he was. He never told me I was special as though the word meant something different from the way it had been used on me by my former fiancé and his friends. He told me, instead, that I was capable. And that capability was the kind of thing a man who had built his life on reputation could quietly recognize in another person. He told me, one evening when I had made a small, careful joke about the way my former fiancé had once borrowed $300 from my mother and never mentioned it, that I had a clearer memory for kindness than I realized. And that clearer memory was the reason I always knew, even when I was pretending not to, who could be trusted. He did not press the joke. He did not press any joke. He let me decide, slowly, when I was ready to make more of them. We began to take long, unhurried drives on Sundays, when the city was quieter and the streets had fewer people who made it their work to be seen. He did not turn on the radio. He did not narrate the route. He drove the way my father had driven when he was well, with the windows cracked, and one hand resting on the wheel, and the kind of attention paid to the road that suggested a man was giving the simple act, moving through his city the dignity of being done well. We talked, sometimes, about books I had not read and books he had read twice. We talked, more rarely, about the people I had been told he frightened, and about how fear, in his line of work, had a way of cleaning a room of the kind of dishonesty that wore perfume. He told me, on one of those Sundays, that the city had a way of teaching a man which silences were the loud silences, the kind you kept when something had just been decided, and which silences were the soft silences, the kind you kept when you were simply happy to be sitting next to the person beside you. And he said, without looking at me, that he preferred the second kind. We did not, in those early weeks, talk about the kiss. The kiss had been a thing he had chosen, deliberately and with care, not to bring up, and I had chosen the same, and the silence between us on that single subject was, I slowly realized, the most honest conversation we were having. We were, in that silence, agreeing not to make a small thing into a louder thing, and the agreement was the first of many small agreements that would, over the following weeks, quietly become the foundation of a life neither of us had quite admitted we were building. My former fiancé tried to call the following week. He tried twice on Monday, once on Tuesday, and once on Wednesday afternoon when my mother answered and told him, in the polite, devastating voice she reserved for people who had wronged her children, that I was unavailable. He left a message I did not listen to. He sent a text I did not open. He drove past my mother's apartment once, at a careful distance, in a borrowed car, and when my sister saw him from the window she called me and said, with the particular satisfaction of a younger sister who had not trusted him from the beginning, "He looks like he has not slept." I told her I was glad, and I did not feel guilty for being glad, and that small, ungilded pride was the first truly honest thing I had felt in 7 years, the first feeling in a long chain of feelings that had been honest in the way a coin is honest when it lands heads instead of tails. I did not tell her the rest of it yet. I did not tell her that I had begun, somewhere between the third Sunday drive and the fourth, to suspect that a man could sit with a woman in silence, and not require the silence to mean anything more than that the moment had been complete. I did not tell her that I had begun, even more quietly, to suspect that I might want to be the woman beside him when the silence happened again. I would tell her eventually, over a long breakfast on a weekday morning when the restaurant was almost empty and the coffee was strong, but not yet. Not yet. Because some pieces of information are too tender to be handed across a table before they have settled into the bones. I did not tell her the rest. I did not tell her that I had begun, somewhere between the second Sunday drive and the third, to suspect that a man could be quiet and capable at the same time, that a man could be powerful and not require me to be small in order to feel that power acknowledged, and that a man could take a woman to dinner without once mentioning the dress she had chosen to wear, because he had noticed her face before he had noticed anything else. My former best friend grew visibly jealous when mutual friends described how deeply the boss respected the woman beside him. She had grown up believing that what men valued most in women was the willingness to be chosen. She had not understood, until she saw how he treated me, that there were men who valued being chosen by a woman even more. She began to drop small, regretful remarks in the comments of mutual friends' photographs. She began to send me careful messages I did not answer. She began to insist, in the tone of someone trying very hard to revise history, that she had not realized my former fiancé had been planning any of this, and that she had only learned of his feelings for her the morning of the wedding, and that she had been confused, and that she had been sorry, and that she had wanted to talk to me, and that she had been trying to reach out. She had been trying to reach out the way a person reaches for a thing they have dropped from a moving car, only when they realize too late that the thing they dropped was the only thing they actually wanted. I did not respond. I did not need to. The silence I had begun to keep was the most eloquent thing I had ever said, and it was, I realized, the only thing I could say that would not be misused. The silence I kept was not cruelty. It was conservation. I had a limited amount of energy left, and I was going to spend it on myself. I had spent 7 years spending my energy on a man who had learned to mistake the spending for affection. I had spent a decade spending my loyalty on a friend who had been saving it up to spend on the moment of her choosing. I was done spending. I was going to keep. I realized, slowly, and then all at once, that I no longer cared about making either of them jealous. I cared about him. I cared about the man who had witnessed my worst moment in a garden, and never once made me feel like a problem to be managed, a wound to be dressed, a project to be repaired. I cared about the man who had handed me a glass of water at midnight and not tried to distract me from my own grief. I cared about the man who drove me home without telling me how brave I had been, because he understood that bravery is not something a woman wants to be congratulated for. Bravery, when it is being performed in private, is simply the only way left to stand. One evening, sitting on the balcony of his house while the city glittered below us, and the small fountain in the courtyard made a sound like a polite, repeated apology, I finally told him the truth I had been carrying since that first reckless kiss. "The first time I kissed you," I said. I wanted someone else to regret losing me. I wanted him to look out the window and understand that I was no longer waiting. I wanted her to see, even for a moment, that the woman she had tried to ruin had found her way to a man she could never have. I was quiet for a moment. The fountain kept its small rhythm. I wanted to be a thing neither of them could dismiss. He grew very still. He watched me with those unreadable dark eyes, and I could tell, from the way his jaw tightened by the smallest possible measure, that he had known some of this already, that he had been carrying an honest suspicion of what had moved me to kiss him in a garden, and that he had chosen, on purpose, not to bring it up until I was ready. He had, I understood, been carrying a particular patience with the kind of patience a man carries when he has decided he will wait as long as the woman beside him needs, and to wait, and not one day less or one day more. I took his hand in mine. His hand was warm. The skin along his knuckles was a little rough, in the way hands become rough on men who have built their lives with their hands. I finished, looking directly into his eyes so he would understand that the next sentence was the one I had been working toward for weeks. If I kissed you now, it would only be because I chose you. Not because he hurt me, not because she won, not because the world owed me something for the way I had been left. Only because I wanted you, and I had finally stopped pretending I did not. For a long breath he said nothing. The night was quiet. The fountain kept its small rhythm. The lights of the city flickered once, the way lights do when the wind shifts, and I let myself wait, because I had learned, over these weeks, that he was a man who considered his words before he spoke them. And I did not want to rob him of the small, important silence he needed before he was ready. Then softly, almost into my hair, he said, "Now you can finally stop looking back. You do not owe them anything. You do not even owe yourself the explanation. You can simply be here with me in this quiet hour, and let the rest of it go." His voice was low and unhurried and carried no urgency at all, and I understood that the sentence was not a verdict on my past. It was a permission slip for my future. He was telling me, in the gentle, deliberate language of a man who knew how to be quiet without being cold, that I was allowed to put it down. I understood, then, what he had been doing all along. He had not been protecting me the way men sometimes protect a woman they have decided to keep. He had been protecting me the way a person protects another person who has begun, slowly and at great cost, to remember her own worth. He had been waiting for me to be the woman he had already seen. The woman who had laughed with her father, who had pinned a ribbon into her hair for luck, who had refused to cry in front of people who had not earned her tears. He had been waiting, with the patience of a man who had nothing else to prove, for me to kiss him back. This time, I kissed him willingly, not to wound anyone, not to be seen, not to make a point across a courtyard. I kissed him because I had chosen him, and because choosing him had taken a kind of courage I had not known I possessed until I had been practicing it quietly, in small, ungilded ways, for weeks. The kiss was slower than the first. It was not a gesture. It was a decision, made in the body as well as in the mind, and it carried with it the entire weight of the woman I had decided to become. It carried the 7 years I had spent learning how to be loyal to the wrong people. It carried the long quiet of the bathroom where I had stood under the running water the night I had come home. It carried the small, repeated Sundays in the back of his car. It carried the way he had handed me a glass of water at midnight, and not told me I was being dramatic. It carried the soft sound of him saying my name only when there was something he wanted me to hear. He kissed me back carefully, as though I were a thing he had been waiting a long time to be permitted to handle with care, and when he held me afterward, his hand resting lightly along my back, neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The garden was quiet. The city, for once, did not press its opinions against us. There was no broken fiancé watching from the window, no sister with her phone angled for evidence, no mother folding napkins in the kitchen with questions I was not ready to answer, no man on a borrowed car rehearsing the apology he would never have the nerve to leave on my mother's voicemail. There was just the two of us, finally still, finally honest, finally arriving at the same quiet place at the same quiet hour, the two of us, and the soft lapping of the small fountain, and the long patient city, and the long patient night, and the long patient blue ribbon on my dresser at home, waiting for a child who had not yet been born to wear it for luck. The garden lights blurred behind us. Garden lights do when a person has been crying for a longer time than she realized, and I felt his hand shift slightly to rest against my hair, the way a man touches a woman he intends to keep. I had not been kept by anyone in a long time. I had been chosen. The difference is the entire world. Kept is a thing that happens to a person. Chosen is a thing a person does, with her whole self, knowing that the man beside her is not trying to make her smaller, and is not looking for her gratitude, and is not rehearsing the moment on a borrowed car across town. He held me for a long while, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and unhurried and carried no urgency at all. "Now you can finally stop looking back," he said again, more quietly this time, almost into the night itself, almost as a reminder to the small, fierce woman I had been the morning I had walked out of the chapel. "And start being here with me in this." I let myself rest against him. I let myself be the bride I had almost been, only with a man who had waited for me without ever once asking me to stop being exactly who I was. I let myself be the daughter my father would have been proud to walk down a quiet aisle. I let myself be the friend my sister had always believed I could become. I let myself be the woman who, against every warning, against every whispered rumor about him, against my own quiet fear of ever being abandoned in a garden again, had finally, impossibly, found. He did not ask what I had found. He did not need to. He simply held me, with a hand that had been patient for longer than I deserved, and let me decide in my own time what to call it. The fountain kept its small rhythm. The night carried its small, forgiving sounds. A single moth crossed the light above the doorway, twice. And on the third pass it landed, finally, on the jasmine arch I had passed that morning in a different dress. And I, for the first time since the wedding that never happened, was no longer looking back. I was looking forward, into the quiet face of a man who had never once asked me to be smaller than I was, and I understood, finally and completely, that this was what I had been meant to find, all along, in the place where the broken story ends and the truer one begins, not because the truer one was kinder. Because it was, at last, and at long last, mine.